about heredity, how certain traits or characteristics, physical characteristics, are passed down from parents to children. And we start with this guy named Gregor Mendel. He was a really cool guy. He lived a long time ago, and he was a monk. So he was working for God, living in the monastery, and one of the things he did there was he worked in the gardens, and he figured out some things by paying really close attention to the plants that he was working with. And one of the ones he's most famous for are his pea plants. And he noticed that different plants had different traits. So some of them were tall, some of them were short, some of them had green peas on them, some of them had yellow peas on them, some of them the flowers were on top, some of them the flowers were on the side. And he was curious about how those traits were passed along. So he did a lot of experimentation in his garden. I'm going to put some links on the website for you because he's a really fascinating dude and you should learn more about him. We call him the father of modern genetics. Couldn't have done it without you, Gregor. Thanks. Okay, now we were introduced to this word allele a couple of days ago in our lesson about meiosis. An allele is a different form of the same gene. Make sure you've got that in your notes. So in pea plants, we're going to talk about pea plants a lot today. We have an allele for being tall and we have an allele for being short. It's the same gene, but it's just a different version of that gene. So as you know, we get half our chromosomes from our mother and half from our father. So we have two versions of the same gene. In this tall plant, let's say that this tall plant got the tall gene from mom and the tall gene from the father plant. And this short pea plant got the short gene from the mother and the short gene from the father. That's what those letters are going to stand for in all of the work that we do. Capital T is different from small t, and we'll talk about the words dominant and recessive in just a minute. But first we need to talk about these words. There's genotypes and phenotypes. Now genotypes is the genetic makeup. What alleles are present? What are the actual genes that we see? So, for example, for the tall plant that we had before, we had a capital T and a capital T. We had the tall gene from mom and the tall gene from dad. And from the short plant we saw before, we had the short gene from mom and the short gene from dad. But in the tall plant, we also could have had a tall gene from mom and a short gene from dad, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter which parent is which here. And we can describe each of those three conditions using these words: homozygous or heterozygous. So this one here is homozygous because the alleles are the same. This one here is also homozygous. The alleles are the same. While this one is heterozygous because the alleles are different. You remember we've talked about before the prefix homo means same and hetero means different. Okay, the other big word we need to talk about here is phenotypes. And phenotypes is connected to physical appearance. What does it actually look like? And you might be thinking, how am I going to remember which one's phenotype and which one's genotype and what they mean? Well, I look at the beginning part and I see gene in genotype. So I know this is the genes. This is going to be describing what actually genes are we carrying. In phenotype, physical appearance, phenotype. That's how I remember it. Okay, now let's look a little more at phenotype. So in this case of the pea plants, we've got tall and short, right? That's the physical appearance. We could have a tall plant or we could have a short plant. That's what we're going with. But one of them is dominant and the other is recessive. Dominant is the allele that is expressed physically that covers up a different allele. That sounds really complicated, but let's look at this right here. I'm just going to copy this and paste it over here. So if we have both a tall and a short gene in our DNA, if we're a pea plant, and the tall, if we have both of them, the tall covers up the short, and what we have as a phenotype is tall, okay? So this is, if this is the genotype, this is the phenotype. The dominant kind of covers up the recessive. So the recessive allele is expressed physically only when it's paired with an identical allele, meaning both of the alleles have to be recessive. So in the case of our pea plants, we're talking about this one. We're talking about Shorty. And Shorty has both of the alleles, both of the genes, the one from the mother and the one from the father, were both short. So our phenotype is also going to be short. Now, Mendel studied a lot of different things, not just height, but also the seed shape, the seed color, the seed coat color, the pod shape, the pod color, the flower position. And every dominant trait we're giving a capital letter to, and every recessive trait we give a lowercase letter to, even if it means we're saying that white is lowercase g. It's because green is dominant and it's capital G, so we use the dominant letter, okay? We will be looking at some of these in class, going over some of these in class. But we're going to look at the tall trait right now. Remember how we looked at this before, how when we go through meiosis in the sex cells, we get down to half the chromosomes that we started with. So when we were looking at sex determination last time, and in a female we start with 2 X's, and so each egg cell has an X, right? And in the male we start with an X and a Y, so half the sperm cells have X and half the sperm cells have Y. We're going to look at that in the same way, but with the tall and short traits. So let's say in this female sex cell we have both alleles are for tall, and in this male sex cell one is tall and one is short. So you can see what happens in the female. All of them end up being tall. And in the male, we end up having half of them being tall and half of them being short. Now, if this doesn't have to be the way it is, this could have been a short gene, right? And in that case, we would have had the short gene carried through here and here. And we would have seen half of the genes here down below being short. Well, that just disappeared, but you know what I mean, right? So half of them would have been short. I just used the idea that they were both tall just to show you how they were passed on, okay? So now let's look. We could draw those all out every time and then decide, okay, if this egg matched this sperm and this egg matched this sperm, and try to decide what it is, the traits that are possible. We could do that, but instead we use a tool called a Punnett square. Okay, so a Punnett square looks like this. It's just this square. We put one parent's genotype here, and we put the other parent's genotype here. So let's start with that parent that we just had, where we had 2 tall alleles, and in the second parent we had a tall allele and a short allele. Now both of them would look tall. Both of these parents would look tall. Does that mean that they can have short offspring? Let's find out. Okay, so if this If this egg meets this sperm, we end up with capital T, right? If this egg meets this sperm, again, we end up with capital T. But what if this egg meets this sperm? Well, then we end up with capital T, lowercase t. And if this egg meets this sperm, again, capital T, lowercase t. So these are the potential offspring that these two parents could have. And the genotypes of their offspring can be described in this way, as heterozygous, homozygous dominant, or homozygous recessive. Now, if we look at this, how many are heterozygous? Heterozygous means they're different, right? So this one has different alleles, and this one has different alleles. That's half. So we can say 50%. 50% are heterozygous. What percent are homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive? Well, we have, wow, that was weird. We have these two up here that are both homozygous, and we call them homozygous dominant because both the alleles are dominant. So 50% of the four are homozygous dominant. So we have 50% heterozygous and 50% homozygous dominant. So if they were both yellow, we'd call them homozygous recessive. If they're both green, homozygous dominant. If it's half green and half of them are yellow, it's heterozygous. Now, what does this mean they look like? They look all tall, don't they? Because tall is the dominant gene and it's going to cover up that short one. So 100% of these plants are going to look tall. That's the phenotype. They've passed on that short, this male has passed on that short gene, but they all still look tall. Well, how do we ever get short plants? Can we figure that out? What if we had a heterozygous parent with a heterozygous parent? Well, then in this cell we would have two dominant traits, and in this one down here we would have a dominant with a recessive, and in this one over here we would have a dominant over from here and a recessive from this parent, and in this possibility we would have recessive and recessive from the other parent as well, right? So now we're getting something a little more different things in the mix. Our genotypes would look like what? How many are heterozygous? 2 out of the 4 are heterozygous, so still 50% are heterozygous. But now we've got this one up here, that's homozygous, but it's homozygous dominant. And this one is homozygous, but it's homozygous recessive. So 1 out of 4 is 25%. 25% are homozygous dominant, and 25% are homozygous recessive. Well, what does that mean they look like? What is the phenotype? This one is going to be tall. This one is going to be tall. This one's going to be tall, but hello, we finally got a shorty. Okay, so 3 out of 4, or 75%, are going to be tall, while 25% are going to be short. It's kind of fun to do this. So, I'm going to ask you just in your notes to try out this one on your paper. What if you had a short parent? So that means this parent has both recessive trait, both the alleles are recessive, and a heterozygous parent. So that means one dominant and one recessive. I want you to work that one out on your own. Sketch it on your notes and see what you come up with for genotype and phenotype. Now, not all traits work like that. We're going to talk about color blindness as one of those weird kind of traits next time.